My name is Kate Laddish. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm a member of our steering committee and today's facilitator. And so before I introduce our speaker, just a quick overview of our group. We were founded 5.5 years ago here in Winters, California. And so Democracy Winters is a nonpartisan, pro-democracy, anti-authoritarianism organization that promotes informed engagement in federal, state, and local politics. And we generally meet twice a month on first and third Saturday mornings, although in the summer we go to once a month. And our newsletter goes out every week or two, and it has overviews of our upcoming guest speakers, opportunities for civic engagement, and a call of the week, and more. And so if you're interested in joining our newsletter list, you can put your email address in the chat to me, or you can email us at info@democracywinters.org. And in the first 45 minutes or so of our meetings are our guest speakers. And then after that, we hear from our federal, state, and local issues trackers. So now the reason that many of you are here today, it is very much my pleasure to introduce Sacramento-based journalist Martin Kuz. Martin has covered the war in Ukraine as a reporter and has also written about it through the lens of his father's experiences as a child and young man in Ukraine in the 1920s through World War II. And so Martin returned from his most recent reporting trip to Ukraine 1 week ago. Martin's reporting on Ukraine has appeared in the Christian Science Monitor, Postindustrial, the San Antonio Express News, and is a featured essay in the current issue of Sactown Magazine. And he has served as the Monitor's West Coast correspondent, writing extensively about wildfires, affordable housing, gun safety, homelessness, veterans issues, and police use of force issues. And before writing for the Monitor, Martin covered the war in Afghanistan for Stars and Stripes, was a projects reporter for the San Antonio Express News, and served as a reporter and editor at the Los Angeles Daily News, Las Vegas Sun, Sactown Magazine, and other publications. In 2012, the Carter Center awarded him a Rosalind Carter Fellowship for Mental Health Journalism for his reporting from Afghanistan for Stars and Stripes. We have linked to several of his articles in our newsletter over the past few years, and he spoke with us in 2019 about solutions journalism. So Martin will give a 10 to 15-minute presentation, followed by about a half-hour Q&A discussion. And thank you so much for joining us today, Martin, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction and the invitation to come back and talk with Democracy Winters. Nice to see some familiar faces. And also thanks to everyone else who's joining online. Very much appreciate your interest in Ukraine and support for Ukraine. And like Kate said, I thought I would just start talking a little bit about some of my observations from Ukraine during a couple of reporting trips since the invasion began. And I don't know if anyone else is having any kind of technical difficulties. I'm occasionally having a little bit of a lag. So if that happens, I apologize in advance. Maybe it's my internet. So, or maybe it's Putin. But in any case, I just want to discuss some of the aspects of Ukraine that were interesting to me. And when we move to the Q&A, would very much just like to engage with all of you, whatever topics are you're most curious about. So I went to Ukraine in mid-February. It turned out to be 12 days before the invasion began. And the reason for my timing really came down to two reasons. The first was that since last fall, we had been seeing pretty consistent headlines of a troop buildup by the Russians along its border with Ukraine. And it seemed to me as we flipped the calendar to 2022 that this time Putin was in fact going to invade. He had done a similar buildup in the spring of last year. And in that case, he wound up pulling back, but not entirely. He had put about 120,000 troops in the shadow of Ukraine's border and wound up leaving about 80,000 in place, along with all the equipment and the vehicles and so forth. So by the time we got to February of this year, and he had about 200,000 troops amassed along Ukraine's border, it seemed to me it was just a matter of time. And the time seemed to me like it would be right after the Olympics, not only because he had done something similar in 2008 with Georgia, but because the Winter Olympics were taking place in Beijing, and China is one of the few countries that Putin genuinely needs as an ally. And I didn't feel that he was going to sort of infringe on the Olympic spectacle with an invasion. So I arrived around, I think it was February 12th, and I immediately went down to the southeastern part of the country, an area known as the Donbass. That's Luhansk and Donetsk Republic. And in 2014, Russian-backed separatists, with no small amount of help from the Kremlin, had staged an uprising in the southern portion of the Donbass and had occupied portions of Luhansk and Donetsk. And since that time, there have been sort of varying levels of fighting. So for about 8 years, you had what was called a frozen conflict. And people there lived in a kind of suspended state. There was tremendous destruction as a result of that fighting that began in 2014. I saw homes and high rises and churches and factories all leveled, and people separated from their families, because when that uprising began in 2014, inevitably some people fled from the fighting. Others chose to stay or had to stay because they were too frail to move, or for other reasons they needed to. They simply didn't want to leave home. So I was able to sort of see what felt to me like a terrible preview of what a wider war might look like, and saw in the Donbass an area that had been broken in many respects by Russia. Their notion of liberating seemed much closer to oppression to me. And the people there were incredibly resourceful and resilient. Ukrainians are a very strong people. They figured out a way to live despite these terrible and oppressive conditions. But there was also a kind of great sadness that they found themselves, as Ukraine, it's only been an independent country for about 30 years, still trying to find its democratic feet in a sense. And now you had this intrusion by Russia that had really upended life there. So getting a glimpse of that right before the invasion gave me a sense of what might come if in fact Russia did launch a wider war. And part of that too was visiting troops in the trenches and the front lines, what had been the front lines at the time. And they possess what I would call a kind of prepared fatalism. They were very ready if war was going to come, but they also realized there was not much they could do about it other than be ready. And I sense that in villagers as well. Nobody wants to imagine that war is coming. Even when you're living at the edge of it or within it, it's very difficult to conceive that the worst that we can do to each other as human beings could suddenly erupt within your life and take away everything that you've known and that you cherish. So I left the Donbass, went to Kyiv. This was 5 days before the invasion started. I arrived in Kyiv when the Olympics were ending. Putin made an announcement that he was going to acknowledge the independence of these two so-called breakaway republics in Donbass. And at that point, I had a great sense of dread. I felt a real tightness in my chest. I felt it was certain that this wider war was about to explode into view. And what was incongruous was that within Kyiv, this big bustling capital city of 3 million people, you couldn't have guessed that they were at the edge of war. Life went on as it always did. The streets were overloaded with cars. People were going to work. Restaurants and nightclubs were full. Families were in the park. And I walked around thinking, what's going on here? I mean, you're likely to face a much wider invasion here. But I think, again, it's the kind of way we think about war, or perhaps don't think about war. It is a very, very difficult thing to conceive until it actually happens. And then you have to hope that you can react the best that you can. And of course, prior to the invasion, President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine had been insisting that war wasn't going to happen, that Russia would not invade. And there's been some discussion since then whether that was a ploy on his part to kind of keep the population reasonably calm, while at the same time getting his military ready for that potential invasion. But in any case, I felt I was deeply, deeply worried. I felt like it was just a matter of time. And February 24th, the war erupted, and I was in Kyiv. Missiles started hitting the city. Huge artillery battles on the outskirts of the city. It came to light later that Russia was trying to seize control of an airstrip at the edge of Kyiv that would have allowed Russian troops to really flow into the capital with much greater ease, and probably raise a flag above one of the parliament buildings, government buildings, which I think would have really changed the tenor of how the world viewed the war. But there were two, what I would call two major miscalculations by Vladimir Putin. One was the confidence in his own military. I think he felt that superior size would just overwhelm the Ukrainian forces. The other miscalculation was the ferocity of the Ukrainian military response. Back in 2014, the Ukrainian military was essentially volunteer. It was a ragtag collection of people who thought, we need to defend our country. And it really the Ukrainian military suffered a lot of losses at the start of that war in the Donbass. 8 years later, it is a professional fighting force. It has received a tremendous amount of aid and training from the West, but it's also the commitment of Ukrainians themselves, a desire to remain a democratic, sovereign nation. Even with the close ties between Ukraine and Russia, and the fact that many families have relatives on both sides of the border, many Ukrainians grow up speaking Russian as their first language. The Russian Orthodox Church has been a mainstay within Ukraine. And I think the Ukrainians realized that what they hold dear and the direction that they wanted their country to go was now under threat. And since 2014, they had really built up their forces and had treated their military as a profession, as we do here in the United States, that this was something that had to be at the ready at all times. And that Ukrainian military response in those early days of the war, which now almost seems like a decade ago because the fighting has been so intense for so long, but that initial response was so strong, so coordinated, so effective that it allowed Ukrainian forces, it bought them time and prevented Putin from the 3-day war that he supposedly wanted, to be able to capture Kyiv, install a puppet government, and take control of Ukraine, a nation of 44 million people. So I watched Kyiv empty out in this, like literally overnight. It became this ghost town. People fleeing west to get away from the worst of the fighting. People boarding trains, boarding buses, piling their belongings into their cars and heading west to Lviv, which is the largest Western city, about an hour's drive from Poland. And I managed to get on a train, got to Lviv, and this was then sort of the next stage of the war. It's an ongoing stage, really, but it was a time when you saw this huge surge of refugees and the heartbreak of families split apart. I stood on a train platform and watched fathers, husbands saying goodbye to their partners, to their children, everybody in tears, hugging each other goodbye, not knowing whether they would see each other again. And at any given time in Lviv, they had something like 200,000 refugees staying within the city, in schools, in churches, other public spaces, and in many cases in people's homes. And one of the, I think, prevailing themes of this war has been the unity of the Ukrainian people, their desire to come together and help one another in whatever way they can. And that opening of homes to complete strangers showed, I think, that Ukrainian solidarity that Russia did not necessarily anticipate, and I think, candidly, the West did not anticipate. I think a lot of Western observers felt that Ukraine might, in fact, splinter if there was this wider war, and that didn't happen. I think now, in many respects, people look at Ukraine as a model democracy, the kind of democracy that we wish that we might be, where we are truly united for common causes. Even though that there were differences of opinion before the war and now, but a desire to act in each other's best interests and to recognize one another's essential humanity. And the compassion that ordinary Ukrainians showed to one another was, to me, as extraordinary as the response of the military. Both, whether you were in uniform or you were a babushka and a parka, you were working to help your fellow Ukrainian. And I found that to be remarkably inspiring in these extremely dark and difficult circumstances. And so when I left Lviv 5 weeks after I had arrived in Ukraine, I felt strongly that I would have to go back to try to continue telling this story. And so in about a month ago, I went back to try to sort of get a sense of, I guess what you would say would be sort of if you were to kind of flip the script a little bit, I saw a lot of people leaving back in February and March. Now, a large number of people are moving back into the country, or they're returning to their homes if they were displaced internally. I think the estimates are something around 7 million Ukrainians left the country after the war began, and another 6 million or so were displaced. And now I think the numbers of Ukrainians who have returned, I think the estimates are perhaps somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.5, 3 million have come back from abroad. And I was curious to ask people a little bit about why they're coming back, given that the war is still going on. And even though it seems as if the front line has been established, we're seeing just even in the last 72 hours, these strikes in different parts of the country that are, again, taking an enormous toll on civilian life. And that randomness of the Russian, the randomness of the Russian attack on Ukraine, it is, I think, been described as terrorism. I think that's a fair word for what is happening, because again and again and again, we're seeing targets struck that have absolutely zero military value. They are simply about terrorizing the civilian population and about trying to drive people out. And yet Ukrainians, in their strength and in their resilience, are determined to reclaim what they have lost, even at the level of the personal loss of people who have lost loved ones, whether they were civilian casualties or soldiers who have been killed. But they are, I've met families who are going back to their homes that are rubble and are saying, we are going to rebuild. People who have lost their jobs because their employers, I met a man who's a waiter at a restaurant. His restaurant was where he worked was destroyed. But he says the owner is determined to rebuild. So he's gonna stick it out, and he's gonna wait to get his job back. And I saw again and again and again these people who are determined to not allow Russia to wrench their country away from them. The history of Ukraine and Russia is so torturous and so intertwined. But when Ukraine gained its independence in 1991, and at the time that the Soviet Union collapsed, there's no question that Ukraine made mistakes and struggled to break free of Russian control and influence over the country. But I do think there's a tendency in the West to kind of wag our fingers at a country like Ukraine and say, why didn't you solve all your problems in a span of about 30 years? Well, all I can say is that if a lot of Western democracies had to have solved all of their problems within the first 30 years of their existence, probably very few Western democracies would exist. And keep in mind that Ukraine is about the size of Texas. Russia, a much, much bigger country. It would be as if Texas were surrounded by the rest of the United States and facing an invasion from that neighboring country. So if you think about it in that geographical context, you understand what Ukraine is up against. And Western allies have been very strong in terms of trying to provide aid. But there are a lot of questions as to whether or not that aid will be sustained. I think the Ukrainian fighting spirit and the desire to remain a democratic country, I don't think there's any question that will remain at full flame. It's up to the West, I think, to be able to continue to support. It's their decision to support Ukraine, to support democracy, and potentially, I think, prevent Russia and Putin in particular from advancing beyond Ukraine, and extending his invasion into other countries. The last couple of things I'll just say is that when I was on the second trip, I went to Kyiv again and went to suburbs of Bucha and Irpin, which are names that many of you likely recognize. These are places where horrible massacres occurred in the first 6 to 8 weeks of the war. Civilians gunned down en masse, buried in mass graves, and my own sense of heartbreak in visiting those places, it was profound because it brought into focus, obviously, the very human dimension of what was occurring and how so many families were being affected by this war. And again, I was struck by how families who have lost their loved ones continue to insist that Ukraine must be free, that they will fight for a sovereign nation, and that the Russian threat must be repelled. And no one ever wants to see the best in human character as a result of war. But I think time and again, what we see in Ukraine and among ordinary Ukrainians is the tremendous strength of the human spirit to bond against a common enemy and to fight fight truly for freedom in the best sense of that word. And I saw this in and around Kyiv, in and around the northern city of Cherniv. I met a woman named Anna whose home was destroyed after she and her husband had spent a decade building it. They had moved in January, and by February, that house was reduced to bricks. And I asked, why would you stay? Why would you stay when you've lost your home, when there's the risk that war might come back to your city? And she simply said, it's our Ukraine. Our family has been here for 150 years. We're not leaving. And I know that when you talk about it, you'd say, well, of course, that's what you would say, right? But when someone tells that to you and they're standing in front of their dream home that has now been reduced to ruins, and her mother was there, the kind of classic Ukrainian babushka, and she was as feisty as her daughter, saying, "We will stay, we will rebuild, and this is our Ukraine." And as a reporter, you go into these places, and you know that you have the chance to leave. You don't have to stay, and yet I have felt the story of Ukraine on a very deep level because I have a strong personal tie to the country, as Kate alluded to in her introduction, which is my father was born in Lviv in 1923, and he grew up in the sort of man-made famine that Joseph Stalin inflicted on Ukraine, the Holodomor, that claimed an estimated 4 million to 10 million people, and was thrust into World War II. And in his case, he decided to join the independent Ukrainian army and fight for Ukrainians' freedom against the Soviet Union. The idea was that hopefully, if things went well, Ukraine would be able to establish its own borders free of Russian rule. As it turned out, he and his unit eventually surrendered to the British, and he was under an agreement that the British struck with the Allied forces. He was allowed to go to England with the fellow members of his unit. And so he spent some time in England and Ireland. Eventually, he immigrated to the United States. And that's where he met my mother, Ingrid, who is on the call today, and helped raise a family, myself and 2 siblings, and established his own family medical practice. And in many ways lived the sort of immigrant American dream. But Ukraine was, for him, a kind of unhealed wound. He was never able to go home, because if he had gone back to Ukraine while the Soviet Union still existed, he likely would have been executed. At the very best, he would have been exiled to, far-flung Siberia, and likely would have died there. So he knew that going back was impossible. When the Iron Curtain finally dissolved, his health had taken a turn for the worse, and traveling long distances was no longer possible. So my father left Ukraine he probably last set foot in Ukraine in 1944, and he lived until 2015. So over the last 70 years of his life, he was never able to go home. And that has sort of informed my perspective on Ukraine and on my reporting. And I'll do a little plug here. I've written about Ukraine and my father for the new issue of Sactown Magazine on newsstands everywhere throughout the Sacramento region. If you go to the website, sactownmag.com, you can find a tab there that says buy, which will give you a list of where you can pick up the magazine. So with that, I would just say thanks for the opportunity. Hopefully that wasn't too long and too boring. And I would really, really love to hear your questions, your comments, and to take the conversation wherever it is that you would like to go with it.
Martin, thank you so much for that. That's beyond compelling. And so I do have some photos. I didn't want to throw them up there and have everything jump into full screen while you were talking. But if there's some photos that come up during the discussion, you're welcome to just let me know and I can bring them up. So we'll turn it over to questions. And Patrick, you are ready to go. So take it away.
Good morning. And Martin, thank you very much for your reporting. It's a delight to have firsthand reports. We often question what we hear on the news, and so it's great to hear from you. I'm just curious to know more of your thoughts about the prospects for democracy in Ukraine. I know you mentioned that it's a young democracy, still has a lot of kinks to work out. I've read about a little bit about the suppression of the free press by President Zelensky. So I know you see all sides, and I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about your thoughts.
Thank you, Patrick. And you're right. Prior to the war, President Zelensky of Ukraine his approval ratings were plunging. The suppression of media or an attempt to exert greater control over the media was frustrating to a lot of his supporters, because there had been this sense that perhaps his election would usher in a new era. But I have friends there who work in the Ukrainian media who will use no small number of mature language, mature words to describe what they thought about Zelensky prior to the invasion. And there was still enormous control and influence at a political level, federal political level, of oligarchs. The country in a lot of ways had not been able, like a lot of the other post-Soviet republics, to kind of graduate to the next level. Part of that was, I think, proximity to Russia, and the fact that Russia attempted, more so than I think any other of the former Soviet republics, Russia attempted to manipulate and control Ukraine because of its great value, both in terms of its industry and its agriculture. You've heard the term breadbasket of Europe. We're seeing it now with the blockade of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. You're seeing how valuable Ukraine is. It's this enormously valuable asset in the eyes of the Kremlin, and that had, I think, a tremendous impact on reform efforts within Ukraine. But you also had infighting within Ukraine going back to the Orange Revolution in 2004. A failure of Ukrainian politicians to unite, to recognize that there was a greater threat than their own sort of political jockeying, that Russia presented this sort of existential threat. Zelensky, I would think it would be fair to say that he had not performed the way people had hoped in terms of ushering in more democratic reforms, and there was a fear that, in fact, it was more of the same with him. February 24th happens, and his stature transcends perhaps any leader since Churchill. His performance has been extraordinary as a wartime president. with that comes, I think, an expectation that when Ukraine prevails, and that is the term that you hear most often in Ukraine, not if Ukraine prevails, but when Ukraine prevails. When Ukraine prevails, it is an opportunity for Zelensky or who's ever in place as president and that administration to wipe the slate, to root out oligarchs from the political system, and to really institute these democratic reforms in a way that will allow Ukraine to break free of the sphere of Russian influence, and also establish its own sort of institutions and democratic reforms. I think that it's it's the old time will tell, and there will obviously be a massive rebuilding effort. But I do think the war presents, in a sense, two opportunities, as awful as they are. One is for Ukraine to become a true democratic nation. The other is for the West to take advantage of an opportunity that it let slip in the early 90s, which is to recognize that Russia has imperialist tendencies. That's its history. That's not a smear on the Russian people. It is the way Russia has conducted itself throughout its history. The West is now on notice, fully on notice. We've seen NATO expand, we'll likely see the EU expand. The West cannot allow Russia to continue to commit this kind of aggression against free and democratic countries, even if those free and democratic countries are struggling to be free and democratic.
Thank you.
Great. Terrific question, Patrick. And Catherine, go ahead.
Hey, thanks for making the time to come and talk to us, Martin. I'm wondering if you have any experience, you had any observation on which humanitarian aid organizations are being the most effective? Like I've heard some not too good things about the Red Cross.
The one that you'll hear again and again and again, because they seem to be everywhere, is World Central Kitchen. And I can vouch for the fact that they are everywhere. I have gone to so many small villages, and I have seen World Central Kitchen handing out prepared meals, making fresh meals, holding events for children. They are a group that they really execute their vision, and they make an effort to, I think, take those charitable contributions and have an impact on the ground. I've been asked this question a few times by different people, and World Central Kitchen has really emerged as the one where I kind of steer people toward, because beyond what they do in terms of food, they seem to have a good way of helping get other supplies into the country. And after the conversation, Catherine, if you'd like, I'm happy to send you a few other organizations that I know from what I've seen are doing good work on the ground, or I can pass it on to Kate and she can share that with the group. But that is the one that comes to mind. Just on this most recent trip, I was in the suburb of Irpin, just outside Kyiv, and I met these two lovely babushkas, Tatiana and Olga. They're both, I think, in their 70s, maybe 70s and 80s. They've been friends for 50 some years. They met when they both moved into their respective apartment units in this high rise in Irpin that was partially destroyed early in the war. There they are. And I met them while they were standing in line at a World Central Kitchen food truck, waiting to pick up some warm meals that they were then going to walk home with. And I went back to them. This is in Tatiana's home. And there they are, and they embody, these are two women who left the country, went to Poland when the war started, and they exemplify the Ukrainian spirit. It's not only because their families are in Ukraine and that was where they were born and raised, but it is also a feeling that this country belongs to Ukrainians. And so they took the bus back from Poland after spending, I think, about 2 months or so in, I believe it was Krakow. And they, particularly Tatiana, she's on the right, if you're looking at the photo, she was so feisty. She was so, I mean, she was leaning forward as she was talking to me, saying, the Russians must leave, Ukraine, this is our country. And I think it was Olga who referred to Putin as a small little man. which I thought was really an apt description. So here you see in the faces of these two wonderful women and in their words just how determined Ukrainians are to fight for their nation. But again, to Gavin's question, it was that World Central Kitchen food truck, just a little truck of a small line of people, and just struck up a conversation with them and learned a little bit about their story. So I'll be happy to supply a few names after the conversation to Kate, and hopefully she can distribute those as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ken, go ahead.
Yeah, that was really nice to hear. And you know, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool optimist, and I just love your optimism. I love having heard so much about the optimism of the Ukrainian people. It's just inspiring to optimists everywhere to be so strong in the face of such horrible aggression. So question, I guess, is a two-part question. You hear a lot of stuff in the press about what the end game is here. And clearly Ukrainian people have a strong sense that they want their entire country back. But there is this kind of sub-thread there about maybe Putin would be satisfied with taking the East or the Southeast, and maybe a negotiated solution is possible that would allow Putin to back off with honor and not take the whole country. And I put that up against the reporting of the ferocity and optimism of the Ukrainian people and say, what do they think about it? Is that just the West trying to wash its hands of it? Or what do the Ukrainians really think about the end game? And do they think that kind of a sort of two-state solution, if you want to call it that, Russian annexation of the Southeast, would that be okay in Kyiv or Lviv?
I think the short answer is absolutely not. And it's interesting in that going back to 2014 when Putin annexed Crimea, and then the Russian-backed separatists staged their uprising in Donbass, and the sort of the lead into that was in fall of 2013. Then President Viktor Yanukovych had decided not to sign an association agreement with the EU that would have established stronger economic and political ties between Ukraine and the EU. And that set off the massive protests, kind of commonly known as the Maidan. They're best known in Kyiv, but really throughout the country. And what I think what gets lost a little bit in the context sometimes is that the reason that those protests exploded was that Ukraine was quite clearly moving more and more to the West, wanting to associate more closely with Europe. And Yanukovych, who was effectively a Russian puppet, suddenly turned away from that. And politically, he paid a price. Ever since then, Ukraine has paid a price because it infuriated Putin. He really, within hours after Yanukovych fled office and the country, annexed Crimea, and a short time later, you saw the Russian-backed separatists start to try to lay claim to part of the Donbass. Since that time, and prior to that, if you had asked the question as far as how Ukrainians feel about Russia, you would have seen in polls a lot more ambivalence, a lot more of a kind of evenly divided opinions. Since 2014, increasingly, public opinion had shifted in favor of Ukraine and in favor of moving more toward the West, specifically toward building stronger ties with NATO and the EU, and hopefully getting into both of those. And if anything, if Putin for a moment, and I actually think on some level, he did believe that Ukrainians might welcome Russian troops if there was a wider invasion. The same kind of misguided thinking I think you could say about what the US believed when it went into Iraq in 2003. Certainly there was a sentiment that Iraqis would just feel as if they had been liberated. And I think Putin might have thought the same with respect to Ukraine. If he had spent 15 minutes in Donbass an area that's it's heavily Russian in terms of its language, its culture, its heritage. If he'd have spent 15 minutes there, I mean, I spent a better part of a week there. What I heard from people who grew up speaking Russian, who still speak Russian, who attend Russian Orthodox churches, we do not want to be Russia. You know, and these are the people who are living right in the shadow of Russia, only miles away from the border. So today, when Russia has laid waste to so much of Ukraine, I think if you were to somehow conduct a poll of what Ukraine wants, what Ukrainians want for their future, I think you would be polling probably above 85, if not 90% in terms of wanting a whole Ukraine and wanting to be free of Russian oppression. Of course, then there's real politics. What is likely to happen, or what would the solution potentially look like? I think very few observers thought that Russia would launch this big of an invasion. I think typically people thought either it was going to be one big fake, you know, just more ferocious saber rattling, or that if he went in, he would go and try to take the rest of Donbass, the rest of Luhansk and Donetsk republics, and perhaps the Black Sea and Sea of Azov ports. Very few people, myself included, thought he would go this big. The fact that he was repelled says a lot about Ukrainian forces. I also think it enrages Putin. I don't think he's going to stop. I don't think he's going to stop for a very, very long time. And so when you hear Zelensky say, we will take back all of Ukraine, including Crimea, I tend to believe that that is what Ukraine will fight for. I do not think that they will agree to a negotiated settlement. And I'm just one person. Like, I'm not Jake Sullivan's best pal. So I don't know what the discussions are like. So this is maybe, I don't even know if you'd call it an informed opinion, but it's an opinion nonetheless. And my sense is that, you know, you'll hear people say, well, how would the United States react to being told that 20%, roughly 20% of the country's landmass was now going to be occupied? Someone described it recently as saying that would be like California, Arizona, Texas, and a few other states. Now imagine saying, we're fine with that. That's a hard thing, I think, for the people to accept. Whether or not there will be pressure from the West on Ukrainian officials, and particularly on Zelensky, to agree to a settlement is hard for me to predict. But what I have wondered about is Putin is never true to his word. Putin lies as a matter of course. Every time, for instance, in the Donbass, that there was a ceasefire, there were more than 24 ceasefires agreed to in Donbass from 2014 till the invasion. Every single ceasefire was broken. Every time he says he's not going to do something, he almost always does it. So if you're Ukraine and you say, okay, we'll have a negotiated settlement, and Russia agrees to recognize our sovereignty, why would you believe it now when that was the agreement back in 1991 when Ukraine eventually decided to give up its nuclear weapons? It was Russia would recognize its territorial sovereignty. So I don't know, all these years later and after so much destruction and so much death, that Ukrainians would agree to that no matter how much pressure they got from the West. Even if the West said tomorrow, we're cutting off your aid, I'm not so sure Ukrainians would say, well, okay, then we'll let Putin have the Donbass and have the Black Sea. So I think for me, I find it an impossible question in some respects to answer, but my inclination is to think Ukrainians are not done fighting for their country, not anytime soon. And I don't think anyone is going to be able to tell them to stand down. If they'd make that decision on their own, that's their call. But I don't think they will accede to the West insisting that they stand down because they're angry. They're angry. And in addition to that optimism, there's a lot of anger.
Yeah, great answer. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Mary Ann, go ahead.
Yes, hi, Martin. It's good to have you here and hearing your eyewitness report. I have family who live on the southeastern border of Poland who have been very involved in helping the Ukrainians, both with the Catholic Church and as a family. They helped organize some paramedic teams that the family supported to go into there right after the invasion, and also finding homes for some of the people coming over the border. And what they're telling our family, as we want to know how to continue to support them, is that the focus has changed. And as you said, a lot of people have returned back to Ukraine. And in their particular area around Melek, a lot of people have gone back to Lviv. And but what remains is mostly young mothers with children. And she says that's the focus, is trying to provide support items for the young mothers, things for the children, clothing, toys, all kinds of supplies, kitchen and home supplies for them. But what I wonder is the focus of the war is changing. Western cities are getting shelled and bombed that before had been considered safe. So a lot of these people who have gone back to Ukraine, I fear might need to start migrating back into the host countries along the border. And I worry about how that's going to work out, and also about fatigue on the part, war fatigue on the part of the host countries. I know that they got a lot more people in Poland than they expected at the outset to handle. So it was really a logistical problem. Anyway, I was wondering what you thought about that. Also, I wonder about the pollution. I'm hearing horrible stories about the pollution and the destruction of farmland and farm animals and all of that. So if you could speak to that, thank you.
Sure. With two really big topics. I had the same question as you, Marianne. In fact, that was the focus of a good portion of my reporting on the second trip, is why are you coming back? And asking that in a way that is both respectful of the decision to want to reclaim your homeland, but also recognizing that your country remains at war and is under, as you say, Marianne, is under attack. And these attacks are very random. They tend to hit a lot of civilian targets. So we've seen a shopping mall in Kremenchuk. We all in the last 48 hours or so saw the story of the young mother and children killed in Venetia, and on and on and on. The theater in Mariupol earlier in the war, again and again and again. And to, on this trip, see the destruction of apartment buildings. I live here in Sacramento, and I think about looking at downtown and seeing high rises in which buildings are split, scorched right down the middle with a gap, two halves still, or 2/3 still standing, and the middle third gone. And I think you're coming back, and you're certain apparently that war is not going to come back to your home. That is what I ask people. And the point that you make about what's happening in Poland and what's happening elsewhere in Europe is part of the reason why they're coming back. So there's, of course, language and cultural barriers, but there's also the difficulty of finding work and how to earn a living. And even in war-torn Ukraine, people are able to patch together a living a little bit easier than when they go abroad. And I think that's been a big motivation for people to come back. Also, to the extent that in certain places, the assistance will expire after, say, 2 or 3 months. And so then families are on their own and trying to decide, where do we go next? In Ukraine, throughout Europe, as throughout Latin America, in most cultures, there's generational support. So you're not necessarily on your own. There's your grandmothers, your great-grandparents, your cousins, so forth. There are people who really work to help each other. It's rare to find in Ukraine, for instance, it's rare to find someone who isn't maybe living with a parent or has their parent next door, or have their grandparents in their home. That's the norm. And when you have that kind of connection with family and to home, I think there's a feeling that ultimately, no matter how bad the circumstances, no matter how terrible the war, it is somewhat more certain than whatever you might encounter when you're abroad and you feel adrift these countries have been, particularly Poland, have been phenomenal in how they have welcomed Ukrainians into their country. The EU gave, I think, gave 3-year temporary residence status to Ukrainians throughout the 27-member EU body. That's extraordinary. It's never happened before, not 3 years. But it shows, I think, that people really have the struggle that they face when they have to leave home under duress. Nobody wanted to leave home, and it all happened so very, very quickly. I have friends who evacuated from Kyiv who at the outset of the invasion were determined to stay. And within 4 or 5 days, they were taking a single suitcase, coming to Lviv and leaving the country. When you leave under those circumstances, all you can think of is, I want to survive. When you get even a little bit of separation from that and you can consider your circumstances and you look around, you say, what am I going to do here? Where am I going to work? Where, I miss my grandmother. I miss my husband, because under the declaration of martial law that Zelensky handed down early in the war, men ages 18 to 60 are required to stay in Ukraine to defend the country. So I think that there is the separation from home on so many levels is so very difficult, and that transcends the fear that goes along with returning to a country that's at war. And as you say, Marianne, I think this is really my concern is somehow I think a lot of people in the West assume that the war is going to be now kind of localized in the southeast and down toward the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. And I'm like, I don't think Putin's done with the rest of the country. I don't think he's done trying to terrorize the rest of the country and perhaps bite off more chunks of the country and perhaps still even try to take Kyiv. I don't think he's done. So I admire the courage of Ukrainians who decide to return. And let's also say that I think a lot of people want to be there because they believe Ukraine needs them. Right? So there's the patriotism that goes along beyond, that goes well beyond rhetoric. It is action. It is patriotism in action. It's not, oh, I will take up arms for my country or I will help my fellow refugees. It's like, I'm going to be there. I want to be there. That I find to what Ken was saying earlier about being an optimist. I mean, I find that remarkable. And I think it's also probably quite rare throughout the world. I don't know that too many places would be this strong for this long and also be committed to perhaps years of similar circumstances. The other question with respect to farming, agriculture, you're right. In addition to the blockade along the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, where millions and millions and millions of tons of crops at this point are not getting out, which is going to result in I think, magnitude of suffering that we cannot imagine throughout Africa and countries in Asia. There's going to be all kinds of I think we are going to be inundated with images and videos of starvation, of children starving in these countries, of people dying in these countries because they're not receiving the food that Ukraine in the past has provided. And that too is part of Putin's plan. It is a war of terrorism. And by depriving Ukrainians in this instance, unlike in the 30s and what my dad endured in the Holodomor, it is not Ukrainians who will starve. It's other huge portions of the world that will starve as a result. And I talked to farmers and other folks in the agricultural sector about what they're trying to do. And without the ports, there are no good answers. The amount of crops the percentage of crops that can actually be exported through the borders via rail and truck is about 25% of the total, 25%. So we're going to see effects fairly soon, but then you're going to see effects extend years and years ahead if this blockade remains in place for any length of time. And yes, you're also seeing Russian troops deliberately target fields, setting them on fire, artillery strikes that hit fields that set them on fire. Again, there is absolutely no military value to that. That is purely about civilian terror. It's also about trying to pressure the West, knowing that there is going to be mass hunger in a way that I mean, mass hunger exists no matter what. But what's going to happen if Ukrainian farmers can't get their exports out, will make what the sort of status quo is look tame by comparison. So that's also, I think, on the West to try to solve, try to find an answer for that. But if Russia holds the ports, I don't really know that there's not a quick answer. There are some answers, but it would take years to reach those, to reach some of those solutions with regard to rail infrastructure and infrastructure at the border for trucks.
Thank you.
Thanks. And we are going to have to wrap up in a few minutes, but I'm going to give myself a question first. One of the things that's come to mind is certainly, I mean, both because you are our speaker, but also some of the stories that have come out of Ukraine is the danger that this war poses to journalists. And you've spoken so eloquently about democracy and the importance of it in Ukraine, but I mean, but worldwide. It seems like supporting journalists and making sure that journalists have the equipment they need, that would be important. Is that something that is there a lack? Is there a need? Is there something that the US and other countries could be doing? And partnered with that, since our organization does a lot of advocacy, and we're so lucky to have a representative here today from one of the offices with which we get to do a lot of conversations. So Aaron, thank you for being here with Congressman Garamendi's office. Is there something that should be on our radar as a situation progresses? Is there something that would benefit from advocacy from us and others?
That's a great question. And yes, so I belong to a Facebook group that is for journalists and who want to work in Ukraine. And on this private group, which is now swelled to, I think, a few thousand members worldwide, there is frequently there's a call for armored vests and helmets for journalists who are going to the front lines. There is a nonstop need for that. And sometimes what gets a little bit forgotten is that it's in particular Ukrainian journalists who need that equipment. And it's Ukrainian journalists who in many ways are telling the story to the rest of the world. There are Western outlets, most notably the New York Times, that are doing remarkable work on the ground, but and a few others alongside them. But it's Ukrainian journalists who are often telling us the story first. If I follow a handful of Ukrainian journalists on Twitter, and their coverage is extraordinary, and it's by tweet, but it gives you a sort of pointillist picture of what is happening across the country, the breadth of the destruction, and also the remarkable response of Ukrainians in the face of that destruction. And so my advice, and again, this is something I can provide after the conversation, my advice is that there are a few Ukrainian news outlets in particular that would benefit from contributions. Off the top of my head, I think of something like the Kyiv Independent, which I don't know if Brian Bonner is on this conversation or not today, but Brian Bonner was the longtime editor of the Kyiv Post. Last fall, the owner basically, he fired the entire staff, including Brian and everyone else who was on that staff. This was the primary English language publication that informed the world about Ukraine and was an indispensable resource. So the entire staff was fired. Much of that staff decided to reconstitute as the Kyiv Independent. It's an online-only publication, and it is, for the Western audience, it is enormously important because they have coverage that you will not find basically anywhere else if you don't know Ukrainian. And so, and they, again, I think their reporting serves as a foundation for a lot of reporting that then we see in the Western press. But there are many Ukrainian language publications, Pravda, Horod, there's another one whose name I'm not going to quite get now, but I will be able to provide those. Those publications need support And they can also then provide the equipment to their journalists who are going to the front lines. And through that Facebook group that I mentioned, the media and logistics group, there are a few journalists who are involved in that, who are the coordinators of that particular page, and they can help get the equipment to the reporters who need it. Because oftentimes it's reporters who are transiting through Poland on their way in who need that equipment, who may not have easy access to it. And those are sometimes Ukrainian journalists and sometimes Western journalists. But I really feel like Western journalists, if they're going into that country, myself included, I mean, I bring my own vest and I bring my own helmet. It's Ukrainians who need those vests and helmets. And if there's extra vests and helmets, then those can be distributed to troops, civilians. And so those are the places where I would say they would be the greatest beneficiaries. And so I'd be happy to provide that information to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And I mean, really, thank you so much for being here and for your reporting. I mean, the work that you and your colleagues do is, I mean, that's one of the underpinnings of democracy. And thank you very much for it. So, so again, it's an honor to have you here today.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, all of the members of Democracy in Winters. Like I said, great to be able to see you again. Hopefully next time I see you, it'll be in person. I'll make one more plug for Sactown Magazine, on sale now. And I also want to, yeah, there we go. So I do want to add just a final thought. I met the mother of a soldier in Lviv just a couple of weeks ago. Her son was killed in fighting in the East. And she told me this story. I'll make it brief, but she told me the story that his final words as he lay dying from the wounds that he suffered in an artillery strike were, "I survived. I survived." And the combat medic who was working to save his life could not believe that this young man could even speak, let alone utter a phrase that was coherent and was, there's Ivanka, that's his mother, holding a photo of Artem. And the phrase "I survived," the family has really rallied around that as something, the words to live by for them, but also that they felt embodied his spirit. This was a young man who in his 27 years lived enough adventure for a century or more. They're establishing a scholarship in his name at the university that he attended. And I can also provide the information to Kate for that, for anyone who might be interested in contributing to it. But I bring up the story not only to tout that scholarship, but also to say, this is the future of Ukraine that is dying, right? These are the future leaders of Ukraine that Putin is killing. Every single day that this war goes on, these are the young people who represent Ukraine's future, whose lives are being snuffed out. And so that is why I find this story so important and so vital. And of course, again, I have those family roots. But I also look at Ivanka here and how she has been so strong in the face of this deeply personal and tragic loss, and who wants to tell the story of her son, but also wants to tell the story of Ukraine, wants people to know Ukraine and continue to care about Ukraine. And so I want to say just thank you very much for this invitation to speak about Ukraine today. I appreciate the interest very, very much. I hope you will stay interested in Ukraine. And like I said, I hope to see Democracy Winters again very, very soon. So thank you all for tuning in and for your patience for my very long answers today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you again, Martin.